Tonight at 10, the Prime Minister is expected to announce plans within days to open new grammar schools in England. It's a highly controversial move. Critics say it'll damage social mobility. Ministers say it'll have the opposite effect.
There'll be no return to the simplistic binary choice of the past where schools separate children into winners and losers, successes or failures.
This policy will not help social mobility, Mr Speaker, but will entrench inequality and disadvantage.
Plans are expected to be included in a government consultation paper within days. Also tonight, a special report on a rebel-held part of Damascus where people have been under siege for 4 years.
Massive disruption in their lives, huge tragedy. But for the government, this is a good day because they are strengthening their hold on the area around the capital.
We'll be reporting from Switzerland on possible lessons for Britain in the Brexit negotiations.
More glory for Sarah Storey
In Rio, it's a record 12th gold medal for Dame Sarah Storey at the Paralympic Games. And why scientists say that they've rewritten the biology of the tallest mammal on Earth.
In the south, the family of a man knocked down and killed by a police car force a review of the decision not to press charges. And patients with a vital vitamin deficiency take medication into their own hands.
Good evening. The Prime Minister is expected to announce plans within days to open new grammar schools in England. The BBC understands that the plans will be included in a government green paper, that's a consultation document, with an emphasis on enhancing social mobility. The schools will be forced to set aside a number of places for children from poorer backgrounds. Critics of the plan say it would be a return to the days when children were divided into winners and losers at the age of 11. Our education editor, Branwen Jeffries, has the story.
The best chance for the brightest kids, or a chance for the few at the expense of the many. Grammar schools have never gone away, one of the great battlegrounds in education.
You can use a calculator.
This is where Theresa May's top advisor came to school. Now it could be the model for a new generation of grammars. Because here, getting a place isn't just about a test score.
I think it's hard to find a test that is going to be immune to practice and to tutoring.
This group of grammar schools sets aside some places. Up to a quarter go to children from lower income families.
It's about the children, isn't it? It's about maximising the impact and the life chances, the impact that we can have on all those children, whatever their background.
Grammars have a history of getting pupils into top universities, but some fear this simply entrenches privilege.
Grammar schools are proud of their tradition of academic excellence. The problem is that very few have gone as far as this school in making sure that poorer pupils get places. It's why the debate about who gets into grammar schools is now going to be so crucial.
The Education Secretary went to a comp in Rotherham. Now she'll have to push through a law to allow new grammars.
There'll be no return to the simplistic binary choice of the past where schools separate children into winners and losers, successes or failures. This government wants to focus on the future, to build on our success since 2010 and to create a truly 21st century school system.
Labour pointed to research showing poor kids have lost, not gained, from the impact of selection.
This policy will not help social mobility, Mr Speaker, but will entrench inequality and disadvantage. It will be the lucky few who can afford the tuition who will get ahead, and the disadvantage that will be left behind. A policy for the few at the expense of the many.
Skegness Grammar is part of a group of academy schools. Closer links like this will be expected in future because each grammar school has a knock-on impact. But will that be enough to meet the concerns of senior Tory critics?
Do not want to blast back to the past in 1950s and so on. If we are going to have new selective schools of any type, they've got to fit in with the system and make sure that they blend with multi-academy trusts, the options for university technical colleges and so on.
A grammar school education is still what some families want, but many believe it's not the best or the only way to give children the chance to excel. Brownman Jeffries, BBC News.
Well, let's go live to Downing Street, talk to our political correspondent there, Vicky Young. Vicky, we know it's a controversial policy. What's the Prime Minister's thinking in pursuing it like this?
Well, for Theresa May, it's all about social mobility. She said on the steps here when she became Prime Minister that that's what she wanted to do, and she feels that education could be the key to that. Now, the problem is with grammar schools, there is little evidence that actually they have been achieving that they've been helping the most disadvantaged pupils fulfil their potential. So she's not simply going to bring in a new wave of grammar schools, she's going to attach these conditions. So it's going to be done in a very different way. A certain number of places reserved for those poorer children, but also these closer ties with local schools. And I think that's an attempt to try and raise standards across the board, but also to try to persuade sceptical MPs and the House of Lords that they should really pass through this new legislation. Now, we also understand tonight there will be changes to the way that faith schools can select their pupils. A Downing Street source said that was to encourage new Catholic schools to open up, schools which they regard as very popular and very successful. But there are many people here in Westminster who think that this talk of a few grammar schools in England is really a distraction from a much broader issue about raising standards in senior schools across the state sector, of course, the schools that the majority of pupils go to.
Vicky, thanks very much. Vicky Young there for us with the latest at Downing Street. Now, diplomatic efforts to build a peace settlement in Syria are intensifying as the US Secretary of State John Kerry prepares to hold talks with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Geneva tomorrow. Both sides have agreed that any deal would involve a meaningful ceasefire and humanitarian access to parts of the country worst affected by the conflict. Now, one of those heavily affected areas is a rebel-held suburb of the capital, Damascus. So from just outside Muadamiyah, this is our Middle East editor, Jeremy Bowen, who's just sent us this report.
The road out of Muadamiyah is paved with guns, tears and loss. These families, in the UN's words, have faced 4 years of unrelenting siege. Children starved. Starving people ate grass amid fighting and aerial bombardment. Many of the children here were too young to remember peace. The departing families had fled to Muadamiyah from Daraa, a neighbouring enclave emptied at the end of August in an evacuation condemned by the UN. For the regime, both places were nests of terrorists. Local men said they were just defending themselves. These are forced evacuations. Siege and starvation make people desperate. Children were dressed in their best clothes for the journey. Their families are still proud. But this was no party. We've left behind tragedy, she said. And it's a tragedy everyone shared. 2 of Ayman's sons were killed, and so were 2 granddaughters.
My heart was broken for my 2 children. They were looking for food, and they never came back. My 2 granddaughters, 10 and 15 years old, were visiting their grandmother. A mortar hit the house. 5 people were killed. Those are my memories of the last 4 years.
Life here, she said, was like death. On the faces of some of these civilians, you can see the strain that they've been living under for such a long time. Now, massive disruption in their lives, huge tragedy. But for the government, this is a good day because they are strengthening their hold on the area around the capital. And for President Assad, that counts as an important step forward. And for the rebels, all this adds up to a defeat. Syrian army soldiers searched everyone leaving. They seem to respect the opposition fighters who emerged from Muadamiyah under a local truce. After a few minutes, the 2 groups warmed up enough to pose for pictures. Again, what do you think of this man? Look, he's there. He's got a picture of Assad on his uniform.
I don't hate him. I don't hate him for his birth. He's a person. He's a Syrian man. I don't hate him. I am a Syrian man also. For me, I want all people who killed us, who killed our children, who attacked us with chemicals to be judged and put in jail. That's what I want.
When's all this going to end?
I think when Assad is gone.
Some rebel fighters could follow the civilians out if they're offered safe passage. This war might have years left in it, but in this part of the capital suburbs, for now, it looks to be over. Jeremy Bone, BBC News, Damascus.
4 men from Birmingham and Stoke-on-Trent have been charged with preparing terrorist acts. They were all arrested on the 26th of August. On that day, an army bomb disposal van was called to a business address in Birmingham. All 4 men will now be brought to London and will appear at Westminster Magistrates Court tomorrow morning. In Paris, a woman has been shot and injured by police as she was being arrested, along with 2 others. Officers were investigating the discovery of a car containing gas canisters near Notre Dame Cathedral at the weekend. France's Interior Minister has described the 3 women, aged between 19 and 39, as radicalised fanatics. A policeman was stabbed during the arrests. The Prime Minister has held her first formal face-to-face meeting with Donald Tusk, who's the President of the European Council, on the preparations for the UK's exit from the European Union. Mrs May said that the aim was to make the process as smooth as possible, and she said that the UK would take time to prepare for the negotiations, repeating that Article 50, which is the mechanism for Brexit, would not be triggered before the end of the year. Well, the former President of Switzerland has added her voice to the debate on Brexit. She told the BBC that Britain should work with the Swiss to try to secure a new deal with the EU, maintaining, she said, access to the single market while changing the rules on freedom of movement. Switzerland, which is not a member of the European Union, is currently trying to renegotiate its relationship with the EU after the country rejected free movement of people in 2014. Our economics editor, Kamal Ahmed, has been to see if Switzerland has any useful lessons for the UK.
It's a country viewed as quiet, serene. But beneath the picturesque exterior, Switzerland has been split by protests over immigration, over its open borders with the EU. Concerns so strong, in 2014, it voted against freedom of movement in a referendum. This small country, wholly surrounded by EU member states, has suddenly discovered it could be a player in Britain's Brexit debate.
This is the beautiful town of Bremgarten. It's in the heart of an area of Switzerland that voted most heavily against freedom of movement. It may not look much like Britain, but the concerns here are very similar to those in the UK. Worries about immigration, worries about jobs, worries about who exactly controls the border with the European Union.
Micheline Calmy-Rey is the former president of Switzerland and well knows how hard it is trying to negotiate with the EU.
It was terrible.
She says it's time for her country and Britain to join forces.
The European Union is very rigid on the question of freedom of movement, and I think if the European Union doesn't integrate diversity inside its institution, it will risk to explode.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are now arriving at the Zurich main station on
From Geneva to Zurich to talk to the man who negotiated Switzerland's major trade deals with the EU. Could there be movement on the freedom of movement?
I think the basic problem is what I call the binary problem. You are either fully in or you're fully out. And this does not serve the interest, I think, neither of the European Union nor of the outsiders. I'm sure that Brexit is sort of a catalyzer for contributing to the debate whether the European Union has to become a bit more flexible.
Theresa May knows she is going to need allies if she is going to get the best Brexit deal possible. And here in Switzerland, she has a willing partner. I've been told that Swiss diplomats have already been dispatched to London to look at opening lines of communication. There is a willingness to cooperate on limiting the freedom of movement, on retaining legal sovereignty and working on those all-important trade deals. When it comes to tackling the European Union, it does appear that two voices may well be louder than one.
There will be difficult issues to bridge. Yes, demands for flexibility, but the EU knows that way lies danger.
If the EU is too soft with the UK, other countries might also choose to exit. And this might be the end of EU integration as we know it now. So it's a very, very important political problem, not only economic.
It's been a long time, 2 years, since Switzerland voted for immigration quotas, and the EU as yet has refused to budge. But that was before a possible new ally decided it had had enough of being in the EU. And that ally is called Britain. Kamal Ahmed, BBC News, Zurich.
Now, on the opening day of the Paralympic Games, there's been notable success for Paralympics GB on the cycling track as Dame Sarah Storey won a record 12th gold medal. She's now become Para-GB's most successful female Paralympian, as our sports correspondent Andy Swiss tells us.
So would the fans come? Well, this was the answer. After all the worries over ticket sales, thousands flocked to the Paralympic Park, hoping for a dramatic day after a dramatic night. Among the opening ceremony's highlights, American Winter Paralympian Amy Purdy dancing the samba with a robot. It wasn't a total celebration, the booing of the Brazilian president, a reminder of the country's problems. But this was the true Paralympic spirit. Torchbearer and former athlete Marcia Malsar slipped on a rain-soaked floor, but the stadium rose in support as she picked herself up and carried on, a determination to succeed which Rio will hope these games can now emulate. But would the first day of action bring a moment of history? The fastest dame on two wheels, Sarah Storey, chasing a place in the record books. She was up against teammate Crystal Lane, but Storey has turned winning into a way of life, and the 3,000-metre pursuit was over in a flash. And so what no British woman has ever achieved, a 12th Paralympic title for Storey and a new pinnacle in an extraordinary career. Born without a functioning left hand, Storey started out as an outstanding swimmer before becoming an even better cyclist. A world beater across two sports, and the woman whose record she's now surpassed told me it was richly deserved.
For Sarah and the sport of cycling to win 12 gold medals is amazing and really well deserved. You know, she actually, did incredibly well as a swimmer, transferred to cycling. There's a bit of me that wished she'd started cycling earlier because that is her true sport. She's an athlete that, everybody should look up to and respect because she's an incredible person.
Earlier, Britain's first gold of the Games had gone to Megan Julia. Just 3 years after taking up cycling following a stroke, the former school sports coach proved unstoppable, catching her opponent with ease. Britain's medal tally off the mark in emphatic style. But the day's biggest cheers came for the hosts. In the visually impaired long jump, Ricardo Costa de Oliveira leaping for glory. The result was Brazil's first gold of the Games. After a difficult build-up, already plenty to celebrate.
Yes, a great moment there for Brazil, and it's turning into a great night for Britain because in the last 20 minutes or so there's been more British success. Another gold medal in the velodrome for Steve Bate and Adam Duggleby in the tandem. There's been gold in the pool, Ollie Hind winning the 400 metres in a new world record time, and there are more medal chances later on in the swimming. John Fox and Bethany Firth, both with real prospects. So 4 gold medals already. It seems that another British gold rush is underway here in Rio, Hugh.
Andy, thanks very much. We'll talk again tomorrow. Andy Smith's there for us at the Paralympics in Rio. Now, the Labour leadership contender Owen Smith has confirmed that he would favour a new referendum on the terms of Brexit negotiated by the government. He was facing questions alongside the leader Jeremy Corbyn from voters in Oldham this evening in a special edition of BBC Question Time. Our political correspondent Alex Forsyth is there. I mentioned the Brexit point, Alex, but how did you see this debate developing and which of them came out on top, if either of them did?
Well, Hugh, we're approaching the final stages of this leadership contest, and despite weeks and weeks of such debates, it doesn't really seem to have moved much. Jeremy Corbyn still deemed to be the front runner among party members, Owen Smith still commanding the majority of support from MPs, and tonight there was familiar territory on domestic policy issues. The two candidates largely agree on the need for investment in public services, on opposing austerity. Their differences on the EU once again clear. Owen Smith saying he thinks we should fight against Brexit. Jeremy Corbyn saying that democratic referendum result should be respected. What this really boils down to is who's the best man to lead Labour. And that was where some of the more heated exchanges came tonight. Owen Smith questioning Jeremy Corbyn's leadership credentials. Jeremy Corbyn saying he is the man who can unite the Labour Party.
Owen, I don't fully understand what the problem is. You obviously have enormous talents. Why can't we work together?
Well, I've said it several times, Jeremy. And I'll say it again to you. If I felt that you were going to lead Labour back to power, then I would work with you in the shadow cabinet. But I feel that you are satisfied to lead us in opposition.
Well, the audience tonight was made up of 2/3 of Labour supporters, and perhaps one of the most striking things was the tangible frustration from some audience members at both candidates. One saying they had rendered Labour unelectable, another saying it was a sad situation, a third saying quite simply it was disgraceful. Perhaps that is a sign that no matter who wins this leadership contest, and we'll find out in just over 2 weeks, they have a mountain to climb, not just in terms of uniting Labour, but more importantly, getting into power.
Alex, again, thanks very much for the update there in Oldham. Alex Forsyth. Millions of pounds will be invested in new flood barriers in England, and more accurate forecasts will be developed following the floods of last Christmas, when thousands of people were forced from their homes in Cumbria and in Yorkshire. Critics say the government's approach is not comprehensive enough. Our science editor, David Shuckman, has more details.
It was a winter that saw storms bringing terrible destruction. The bridge at Tadcaster just crumbling. The record rainfall swamped 16,000 homes. The sight of families being rescued was repeated week after week. So questions were raised about our flood defences, and the government promised a review. Today it unveiled a new weapon against flooding: temporary barriers that can be assembled where they're most needed. The army has units ready for the job, and ministers say this should help.
At the end of the day, we don't know exactly where the rain's going to fall. I can't promise that no home will ever be not flooded again. But what we can do is to say that we're in a better place than we were last winter and being able to respond to incidents.
All these barriers are ready to be deployed to hold back the next big flood. And there are 6 other sites like this across the country. It looks a lot until you read the detail of the report into last winter's flooding and see just how many vitally important pieces of infrastructure, water supplies, electricity networks, telecommunications, are still vulnerable to flooding. The report investigated exactly how many sites are at risk. It found that across England, 820 are vulnerable to flooding. Of those, 290 are kept safe with good defences. But 530 could still be flooded, and the potential impact of that is all too obvious. Even now, the bridge at Tadcaster is still being repaired. Local people have long said the government isn't doing enough for them, and this was the reaction to that investment in temporary barriers.
£12.5 million. Thank you for that, that's great, but let's really get into the detail of it, and I think we'd need to be spending a lot more on the defences.
Emergency repairs by helicopter last winter. The government has committed £2.5 billion to flood defence over 6 years, but that won't protect everyone.
It just came crashing down.
Matthew Brown runs 2 pubs in Hebden Bridge. Both of them flooded on Boxing Day. He's worried he's still vulnerable.
I don't believe, to my knowledge, there's anything at the minute stopping it, so we're still a bit concerned it could happen.
The floods tore through northern England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And Met Office analysis has come up with a worrying conclusion, that there could easily be bigger storms to come. David Shuckman, BBC News.
A court has heard that a mentally ill man stabbed a university lecturer to death in North London just days after prosecutors dropped charges against him for possessing knives and for assaulting a policeman. Dr. Jeroen Ensink was killed as he left home to post cards announcing the birth of his daughter. 23-year-old Femi Nandap admitted his manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility. Bristol Crown Court has been hearing evidence in the case of Christopher Halliwell, a former taxi driver accused of the murder of Becky Godden. The court was told that Halliwell, who's defending himself, is already serving a life sentence for murdering another woman. Today, he cross-examined Steve Fulcher, a former police officer who arrested him for that murder. On the day of his arrest 5 years ago, it's claimed that Halliwell led police to a field where the body of Becky Godden was discovered. He denies murdering Becky Godden, and the trial continues. Public Health England has been asked to investigate high numbers of deaths among drug and alcohol users on the Wirral in Merseyside. BBC News has learned that investigators were called in by the local authority after 74 deaths were reported over the past 18 months. Official figures on deaths related solely to drugs in England and Wales will be published tomorrow. Last year, they were at record levels, as our social affairs correspondent Michael Buchanan tells us.
Merseyside was ravaged by heroin in the 1980s. Liverpool, the first city in Britain to suffer a mass epidemic. At one time, the highest rate of heroin abuse among teenagers was to be found here on the Wirral. Some of those who managed to survive are now dying off rapidly.
You're not thinking back to the last funeral, you're thinking ahead to the next one.
Francis Cook has lost several friends in recent months. Like him, they were former heroin addicts, reliant on rehabilitation support. He feels shortcomings in care contributed to the deaths.
If they'd come in and work in a spirit of openness and sharing and listening to what the service users, the users wanted, needed, then things could have been so different.
Drug and alcohol services on the Wirral are provided by this organisation. Over the past 18 months, we've learned 74 of their clients have died. The local council has asked Public Health England to investigate. Most people died of long-term health problems rather than drug overdoses, says the charity running the service. They say they're collaborating with inquiries, are not under investigation, and provide good support to service users.
It's an opportunity to actually see, can we prevent, can we intervene earlier to help people access the right treatment? We're not obviously a physical health treatment provider, so it's not necessarily in our gift to make sure that people get the respiratory care they need, for example.
But you can pass them on.
Yeah, entirely.
And it's not been happening.
No, it's not happening as much as it should do.
On this street in Birmingham, we found plenty evidence of the city's enduring heroin problem. While the number of users is declining across the country, many still need support. And with rehab budgets being cut here as elsewhere, this former GP, who spent decades working with drug users, has significant concerns.
Anything people can do to put more resources in terms of people and trained helpers and time, then we'll move towards getting a safe drug treatment service again. But at the moment, it doesn't feel safe.
Many former heroin users rely on methadone to survive, but in recent years, government policy has been to encourage abstinence, with providers sometimes paid extra for getting users drug-free. That approach works for some people, but it can have unintended consequences.
Getting people to stop using drugs increases the risk of relapse into heroin use, illegal drug use, and consequently increases the risk of sudden death.
Heroin addiction on the housing estates of Edinburgh was the inspiration for a seminal novel. The so-called train-spotting generation are now dying as long-term drug dependence wrecks their bodies. It's led to record levels of drug-related deaths in both Scotland and England. A heroin epidemic decades ago, still killing people. Michael Buchanan, BBC News. One of the most influential names in the arts world, Sir Nicholas Serota, is to step down as the director of the Tate Galleries to take up a new role as chair of the Arts Council in England. He was a leading light in the creation of Tate Modern, and over nearly 3 decades under his stewardship, the gallery has expanded and the Tate has opened its first regional galleries. One of the pioneers of ska music, the Jamaican singer Prince Buster, has died at his home in Florida. He was 78.
Shake up long, shake up strong, stay on your feet and you can't go wrong. Wherever you are.
His recordings of the 1960s, including One Step Beyond and Madness, inspired a revival of ska music in Britain 2 decades later. Bands including Madness, who took their name from a Prince Buster song, covered a number of his classics. Now, scientists working in Namibia say they've rewritten the biology of the tallest mammal on Earth, the giraffe. The Giraffe Conservation Foundation asked a team of scientists to carry out genetic analysis of giraffes in Namibia and found that the mammals have evolved into 4 distinct species. The previous assumption was that there was just one species of giraffe. Our correspondent Victoria Gill reports now from Chester Zoo.
They're Africa's gentlest giants. But these animals are in decline as their natural habitat is shrinking. That threat was the trigger for an investigation. Geneticists and conservationists worked together to sample giraffe DNA to find out more about these increasingly fragmented populations. And this revealed a genetic surprise. What these new results show is that there are actually 4 different species of giraffe, all very tall, and they look very similar, but they're actually as genetically distinct from one another as a polar bear is from a brown bear. The animals you'll see here at the zoo are just one of the 4 species. They're reticulated giraffes. The others are northern giraffes, southern giraffes, and Maasai giraffes. This might look like a very tricky game of spot the difference, but to conservationists, it's crucial information.
Understanding that they look different is just a start. Now understanding there's real genetic differences helps us perhaps to understand that there may well be big differences in mating behaviour, in breeding patterns, and those of course are critical to conserving a species and really important to understanding how threats might impact upon it and how we can try and reduce them and save species from extinction.
The wild population of giraffes has declined by 40% in the last 15 years. So looking deep into their DNA could help conservationists work out exactly what these animals need from their environment to help protect the habitat that the world's tallest mammals rely on. Victoria Gill, BBC News, Chester Zoo.
Quick reminder that News Now's coming up on BBC Two. Here's Kirsty.
Tonight, we reveal the contents of the government Green Paper, which confirms Theresa May wants to make further selection in English education a key feature of her government. Join me now on BBC Two, 11 o'clock in Scotland.
That's News Now with Kirsty here on BBC One. It's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.